Okay, I'm here with Tommy Wood. And Tommy, thanks so much for doing these master classes again for us.
Oh, no problem. It's a pleasure.
Awesome. Well, in this masterclass, you are going to help people basically get started with a lot of the basics on a keto diet for somebody who maybe is just getting started, maybe he's done it a little bit and just wants to do it a little bit better. But this is really the basics. And in fact, I think even for somebody who's done it for a while, this might be particularly useful just to re-listen to from time to time because your knowledge is so in depth, but also you're able to apply it in a very practical way for people. So jumping right in, if somebody were just starting a keto diet or were thinking about it, what should they be asking themselves? What should they be thinking about in terms of their own life and their own health and their diet when they're getting started?
So I think the most important thing is when you start, you ask yourself why you're doing a ketogenic diet. I always think that people should start with that because the reason why you're doing it will maybe change how you do it, how you track it, how you change maybe some of your macronutrient ratios, how you address some of the other things. So if it's purely for weight loss, say, then that will have there are certain things you need to do for that. If you're maybe trying to do a therapeutic ketogenic diet, so maybe somebody's doing it for cancer, equally could be some kind of neurological disease, maybe Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, or maybe even multiple sclerosis, that will have a slightly different you might have a slightly different approach, and some people will need to be stricter than others. So just start by saying, so why am I doing this? Why do I think I need a ketogenic diet? And from there, then maybe you'll be able to sort of go down the right track, and it'll maybe help you figure things out a little bit more easily.
Perfect. And in the next two master classes, we're going to cover two popular reasons people do it, which is weight loss and then improved athletic performance. But let's just very quickly jump into one that you mentioned there, like neurological issues. Things like, I know keto has been used a lot over history for epilepsy, but now it's also being used to treat and prevent things like Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative diseases or even depression. If somebody were doing it, let's just say for depression, just give me an example of what they would be thinking about, or depression, or let's say more energy in their life in general and more focus. What would they be thinking about in that case?
So particularly when you're going down the route of a therapeutic ketogenic diet, then you're going to be aiming for higher levels of ketones probably compared to somebody who's doing it for something like weight loss or performance. And you're also going to be at the same time shooting for lower blood glucose values, and particularly the ratio between the two, something called the glucose ketone index. But at the same time, if you've got some kind of disease that you're treating, then you need to make sure that you're getting all your other lifestyle things in, sort of bringing the whole thing together. So it's definitely a lifestyle rather than calling it a specific diet, right? It's something that you're hopefully going to continue for a long period of time. And you've got to make sure that you're sort of putting everything in place. So, making sure that you're prepared for your meals, looking after things like stress and sleep, and sort of building a plan essentially, right? So
Right.
particularly, say this is for somebody with depression, you're going to have periods where you feel slightly better, slightly more energetic. You're going to have periods where it's going to be really tough, potentially, as that's sort of the nature of depression. So you want to make sure that you plan things. People know what you're trying to do. Maybe cook things in advance, get sort of all your meals together, and then sort of build yourself a regime so that you know exactly what you're trying to do and when you're going to do it. So then maybe when you're feeling slightly less motivated, slightly less energetic, then you know what you're going to do, and it just makes everything simpler.
Right. Well, let's take a step back for a second, because I know one of the things you mentioned there is like for a therapeutic approach, somebody may be looking at their ketone to glucose ratio, looking at their ketones. And it just occurred to me that maybe somebody who's starting doesn't even understand fully how how keto works, or how being in ketosis works, or how a keto diet works. Can you very briefly explain what is it that a keto diet does, or what is it that being in ketosis means for somebody?
Yeah, so being in ketosis is basically just producing appreciable amounts of ketones in the blood, and ketones are sort of a metabolic byproducts, you can call them that, or a metabolic alternative fuel that's produced from mainly the breakdown of fat either in the diet or fat from your own fat tissue. And this occurs particularly when blood glucose is low and blood insulin is low. So when both of those come down, you start to release more fatty acids. They get essentially turned into ketones by the liver. And we tend, because they're not all technically ketones from like a chemistry point of view, but we call them ketone bodies. So the three that
Right.
people probably hear about are acetone, beta hydroxybutyrate, and acetoacetate. And they can be measured each in their own way, but those are basically the ones that we're making. And when we're making them, they have some specific effects. Particularly beta hydroxybutyrate is probably the one that we measure the most. It's the one we measure in blood, and it's known to have lots of anti-inflammatory and sort of neurologically stabilizing effects, and then also having some sort of if we're talking about cancer, anti-cancer, anti sort of
Right.
cell death, or pro-cell death, depending on which cells you're targeting effects. So that's kind of the main therapeutic one we think about, beta hydroxybutyrate. So those are basically produced when blood insulin and blood glucose start to decrease, and then they have those sort of knock-on effects.
Right. And so being in ketosis is really a sliding scale because, like you said, it's an appreciable amount of ketones, but you could be said to be in ketosis with, relatively small amount of ketones still up to a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. So you probably, even most people will start to make some ketones overnight. So they particularly produce during fasting, right? Because that's when blood glucose and blood insulin are the lowest, and we fast overnight. That's just part of being asleep because we can't eat.
Unless you're a bodybuilder and get up every few hours.
Yeah, unless you're a hard gainer and you wake up in the middle of the night to have a protein shake, which some people do.
Right.
So whenever you are making ketones, that's when we say we're in ketosis, but that can range from very, very low levels. So we measure them in millimolar, which people may recognize. So in Europe, we measure glucose in the same units, millimolar. Whereas in the US, you measure glucose in milligrams per deciliter. So the units are slightly different, but people will probably, if they've done some basic measuring, they'll recognize the units of millimolar. And they will sort of start, 0.1, 0.2. But then when people are really getting up towards sort of therapeutic ketosis, maybe it'll be 4, 5. And then, if you're in starvation ketosis, you can go even higher. And then if people might have heard of diabetic ketoacidosis, which is basically when people have type 1 diabetes, particularly, and they don't have any insulin on board, you produce very large volumes of ketones, and then you could be even higher, 10, 20, even 30 millimolar.
Right.
But that's sort of people who are in nutritional ketosis on a ketogenic diet, they will not see the ketones at that kind of level.
Well, and thankfully so, because that's when it gets toxic.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
becomes a
absolutely. And
major
that's
problem.
yeah,
Yeah.
but it's the big problem is that just no nutrients are getting into cells, right? So
Right.
all your cells are starving because there's no insulin around. Yeah.
Yeah. So you talked a little bit about testing, and you talked about acetoacetate, beta hydroxybutyrate, and I always forget the third of the
Acetone.
acetone. Yeah. How important is it for somebody to be measuring their ketones on a keto diet?
So that's a really interesting question, and everybody has a different answer. And I think again, it depends on what you're using the ketogenic diet for. So if you're using it for a therapeutic reason, so say somebody has some kind of brain cancer that they're using the ketogenic diet for, which is becoming increasingly popular because some people are seeing absolutely amazing effects from that, and a whole lifestyle, but including a ketogenic diet. And then you want to have your glucose to ketone index as close as possible to 1, usually. So we'll say glucose and ketones are both essentially the same when measured in millimolar. And then you might want to be testing regularly to make sure that you're keeping to hit that, and your sort of glucose isn't slowly going up or your ketones aren't slowly going down, because then you might need to try and figure out why that is. If somebody is using it just for, say, weight loss, then I think some testing just to see whether you're in ketosis can be really useful. So you sort of know that you're doing things right. But in reality, when you're measuring absolute levels, it doesn't tell you anything about how many ketones you're making or how you're using them up. It's basically just
Right.
whatever's left over at that exact period in time. So a lot of people say that you need to shoot for a certain level of ketones. So maybe when you're starting to get nutritional ketosis, you measure your blood beta hydroxybutyrate. Getting it over maybe zero point 0.5 is sort of getting towards where you want to be. And then, people say maybe 1 to 3 is kind of like a traditional nutritional ketosis kind of area. But the way I think that people should maybe be using it, if you're just using it as sort of like an overall health thing, then, or weight loss, then just sort of knowing that you're in ketosis, using something to check that you're there, and then maybe sort of, keeping an eye on things is really important. But the absolute level isn't necessarily going to tell you that much about what else is going on. If you're using it for weight loss, then obviously measuring things like body composition but also, how you feel, how you sleep, all of that stuff is really important. So the absolute numbers I'd worry about less, but just sort of know that you're in ketosis and sort of maybe sort of keeping an eye on it. But then I wouldn't really get that worried about the exact numbers.
And that echoes what several of our experts have said. So, like, I interviewed Luis Villasenor as one of our bonus health experts, and he's gets
great.
He's great. And he gets annoyed at people who just end up chasing the ketones, but who are doing it for bodybuilding or weight loss. He's like, it's not a bad thing to measure every once in a while, but it's not your end goal. It's
absolutely. Because you're doing it to hit a certain body composition or just, feel better, perform better. And then your ketone levels don't tell you anything about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So if someone were just getting started with the diet and lifestyle, and you've mentioned a few times that it's, more than a diet, it's a lifestyle, and it's something that people would do not just for a long time, but more than what they eat. But where would they get started specifically? Where would you recommend that they focus almost entirely on their diet at first? And if so, what else would they focus on along the way?
Yeah, so a diet is absolutely where you're going to get yourself into ketosis. It's going to take a certain amount of carbohydrate restriction, particularly, right? That's the whole essence of the ketogenic diet. Right. At the same time, I think people should be, looking after their sleep and stress, and those are things that sound like they're very simple, but it's not very necessarily very easy to do that, right?
What do you mean we haven't solved stress yet?
It's just like you say stress, and like, well, what is stress? I mean, sort of, because to each person that's very different. So but the thing is, we know when people are chronically stressed because of the effect it has on our hormones, and if it's affecting sleep, we know that if we're sleep deprived, then we're going to cause some problems with glucose and insulin signaling. It's probably it may be even harder to get into ketosis. So, making sure that we're getting a handle on that sort of rigid bedtimes, looking after, our circadian rhythm, light exposure, but then also, taking time to sort of step away from things that stress us, or maybe try and identify ways to deal with stresses so that they have less of an effect on us. Again, sounds simple, doesn't mean it's easy to do it, but those are things that are going to, early on are going to make it harder to get into ketosis. So like I said, if you put together a plan, put together some kind of, regimen approach, so you're not just sort of like, oh, today I'm going to start a ketogenic diet and then just stop eating carbs and then worry why, and then wonder why it's not working. It feels so good. Yeah.
Right. And actually, for anybody who actually upgrades to All Access Pass, we have a beginner's guide to the keto diet. You've got the food list and everything, and so and the cookbooks too, which are helpful to get started. So it's all there. When people are getting started, what do you see often the mistakes that people make? I know that one of them you might have just mentioned, right? Like not taking care of the rest of their life, like not sleeping enough, making it hard on themselves because they're too chronically stressed. But what other mistakes do you see people commonly make that keep them from getting whatever results they're after?
Yeah, so it's usually, so like I said, not planning enough, but then also not actually figuring out what or how they should be eating. So, we talk about just restricting carbohydrate, but then, not taking care to look at sort of total calories, proper macronutrient ratios, maybe getting not enough or too much protein, which can maybe, particularly when people are getting started out, they need to be, sort of look quite carefully at their protein intake. Although I do think lots of people restrict protein too much because they worry that it's going to affect their blood glucose level, it's going to affect getting into ketosis. But like I said, if you're doing it for something like weight loss, then the protein is really important there, especially if you're doing some exercise or something at the same time,
right?
Because that's all going to help. So I think people tend to restrict too much, but equally, particularly when you're starting out, making sure that you're restricting carbohydrates enough and then getting the correct amount of protein, because then that will sort of help you get into ketosis. So it might take a little bit of maths and some calculations, and there are actually lots of good calculators out there. People sort of saying, being able to calculate how much protein you should be taking in, how much carbohydrate you should be taking in, and maybe for sort of 1, 2, 3 weeks as you start out, you're going to need to be, a little bit strict about that and sort of, keep a good eye on it and plan some meals and weigh things. But then as you get into it and you sort of figure out what your body needs and how your body responds, then I think a lot of that falls away, and then people become much more intuitive about it, and they know, that's kind of what I need to eat, and then it becomes a lot more simple. So early planning, and maybe sort of taking some time to really figure things out, and then after that it becomes much easier.
And what about food quality in general? Because I know historically we've had a lot of low carb diets, from Atkins to the low carb kind of revitalization in the late 90s, and I've seen in a lot of those cases, in my opinion, it looks like people often, just like paleo and other, they'll start in the end to eat a lot of junk foods that are still within that diet. Do you see that, and do you see that affecting people a lot?
Yeah, absolutely. I think paleo junk food, keto junk food, this is all kind of what we're basically trying to do, is replace the things that got us in trouble in the first place, and then just try and create, just because it's keto or gluten free or whatever, we assume that it's automatically good for us. And I think that's a real false economy there. Right. Because any time that you're mixing these things together, maybe you have some artificial sweeteners, you have, a very high amount of fat. So particularly if you're doing it for weight loss, if you just think, well, I just don't eat carbs, you can still eat too many calories, and then you can still gain weight on a ketogenic diet. That's people who think that that's not possible. That's definitely incorrect.
That was another thing that Luis got very. He's like, I've built my body on a keto diet. He's like, I can clearly gain weight.
Yeah, absolutely. So then, there's all this kind of stuff, when people are looking at, if anybody's selling you keto bars, keto shakes, or just don't bother with it. It's expensive. It's still going to be full of artificial sweeteners and things that are going to make you overeat. So food quality is so important. Meat, eggs, high fat dairy, vegetables. That's where people should start. And there are a lot of people out there, making a lot of money with keto supplements, keto junk food. Especially when you're starting out, just avoid it all entirely.
Yeah. All goes back to hyperpalatability often.
Yeah, exactly. You can still overeat. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, so last question before we wrap up. How can someone make it as easy as possible for themselves, also making themselves feel better along the way? Because I know when a lot of people start a keto diet, it's tough. I mean, it's not just tough. It's tough from a behavioral perspective because you're changing a lot of your behaviors and habits. It's also often tough from a physiological perspective because their body, isn't used to it. They're not good at burning fat. And also maybe they have, micronutrient deficiencies, particularly electrolyte deficiencies, to make them feel bad. So what are your main tips for making it easier for people, both from a psychological and from a physiological perspective when they get started?
Yeah, so like I said, planning is really important. But then from there, like you mentioned, some people might have heard about keto flu, low carb flu, just generally not feeling good those first few days, particularly as you adapt. So electrolytes are really important. Getting enough sodium, potassium, magnesium, particularly the ones that we tend to talk about. And those, so just focus on getting enough of those, because people might not realize is that insulin, we talked about insulin earlier, is one of the things that regulates electrolyte levels in the body. So as insulin starts to come down, then we'll start to essentially pee those out, and then you just have less kicking around, and that can definitely affect the way you feel. So making sure you get enough of those in the long term. Selenium is also really important. So either you sort of find, eat things that have lots of selenium in, so seafood, maybe a few nuts, or make sure you get like a decent supplement, multivitamin, something like that. Yeah. And then particularly if you're trying to get into ketosis, then I think some low level aerobic exercise is really important. That's also going to make you feel good, especially get you going in the day, sort of early in the morning, get outside, some brisk walking, something like that. That's going to get you into ketosis a little bit faster, particularly if you do it in the fasted state. And that's also just sort of like going to give you that. It is uplifting. It's going to give you have multiple effects on mood and things like that, and also get you in faster. So make sure you sleep properly, get up in the morning, have a nice fasted walk, plan your meals, and then supplement if you need to, just sort of make sure get you over that initial hump. And if people do all of that, then it really shouldn't be too difficult.
Awesome. Awesome. Sounds great. It actually reminds me that it's only in the past few months that I've really gotten into a great habit of exercising in the morning. It does changes everything. I do it in a fasted state now, and it's,
Yeah, absolutely.
even just 10 or 20 minutes of like rowing or like jogging or something, just, really
Yeah,
helps a
yeah.
lot.
Get outside. Being outside has so many positive effects on the body. And if you just, yeah, 20 minutes is a perfect target in the morning. Get
Yeah.
up, and that's just a great way to sort of frame your day.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I think it's been brilliant for people to get started. A lot of great tips in here. And obviously in the summit, we go a lot more in depth into a lot of things with a lot of different experts. So if people want to keep listening, then obviously they can listen to all the rest of it. So thank you so much, Tommy. And we'll be back for round 2 soon.
Great.